There's only two safe places on earth: your home and the house of the Lord, period. Those are the only two safe places.
In this episode, I bring back my friend Paul Mero, who is the author of the book Defeated. He was the president for a number of years at the Sutherland Institute, and we talk about the culture wars. Do we step back and put ourselves circle ourselves in a fort and rally, or rather circle the wagons and step out of the world, step out of Babylon? Or is it a responsibility for us to step into Babylon and try to make a difference outside of just preaching the gospel? Do we engage in the culture wars? You should ask yourself that. And as you listen to this discussion, do a little self-reflection, think about it, and decide what your role should be. Now, this episode is brought to you by Go and Do Travel. I am the official spokesperson for Go and Do Travel and the Gospel on the Nile cruise. I've talked a lot about this. If you have not looked into it at all, please just click on the link in the description box and find out a little bit more about it. This is a bucket list type of a journey. People love this trip. You'll learn more about the temple in Egypt than you will anywhere else except inside the temple itself. It is fascinating as you walk through the ruins that are thousands of years old. And there in plain sight, you see the temple all over the place. Go to cwicmedia.com, scroll up to the top to trips and events, and look for Gospel on the Nile. We've got trips in October and November of this year, 2025, and then going into the spring of 2026. Here's the interview. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. On this episode, we bring back my friend Paul Mero, former cultural crusader, cultural warrior, and political crusader. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, happy to do it. We're going to go back and address your book here, Defeated, again. I wanted to go over a few topics on this toward the end of the book. Last time we talked a little bit about, and he got a lot of comments, about the idea of, okay, do you go out and move forward and fight a cultural battle, or do you huddle together, so to speak, and focus inward and try and create a Zion outside of Babylon? And there's a lot I want to bring up that I didn't last time about this. Why is it important not to be a cultural warrior in your mind?
Let me pause 1 second, not you, but me. Mm-hmm. And just, you mentioned there were a lot of comments.
Yes.
And I love your audience. I do. But, several of them were like, he comes across as condescending. He's a know-it-all. And so let me just address that. Yes, I'm condescending because I am a know-it-all. And that's just the way it is. And I apologize to the audience members who struggle with the sound of my voice. And maybe what I say, but a 40+ year career in politics, and specifically fighting the culture war, means that I actually do know what I'm talking about. If I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know, right? I hope I'm a truth seeker. So anyway, we just want to take care of that first. So
sure. Got that out of the way. Got it.
Yep. Now, love the audience. Thanks for listening. First question again.
In your experience, you've been out fighting on the front lines as a cultural warrior in a very political environment.
Yes.
Right. You've been in the trenches on this. Yep. Lessons that you've learned based on the book state that really going after the culture war may not be the best thing to do.
Okay. Right.
Why is that? I mean, if someone else is involved with a culture war and they don't see forward what you've been through already, why would they, what should they consider?
Well, I think in this day and age, with the Trump administration and a conservative-ish Supreme Court, I think it's easy to fall into the idea that the culture war still exists. battles always exist, right? There's always crazy that's happening that you want to address, perhaps you want to protect your children from. uh, that's all natural, and we can't escape that, by the way. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying understand that the war is over. So for instance, the new thing is transgender stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to tell you, I was talking to an old congressional colleague. He was a chief of staff as well, and I said, "Can you imagine our bosses and if they had to deal with transgender issues and men playing women's sports?" Uh, it was crazy enough back in the day when it was mostly gay rights kinds of things, abortion, school prayer, those kinds of things. Um, so we have transgenderism now, and it looks like perhaps the Trump administration and the states now and private institutions urged by the Trump administration are going to handle transgender stuff and DEI. Um, Donald Trump is going to be in office for 3.5 more years.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Transgender people,
As long as he stays alive.
as long as another person doesn't go after him.
Yeah.
But transgenderism is going to be here long after Donald Trump.
Agreed.
And I'm saying, just like I said on gay rights and same-sex marriage and anything having to do with homosexuality or abortion, that those genies are out of the bottle, the toothpaste is out of the tube. There's no way we're putting this stuff back in. And so I'm saying the culture war in that sense is over. I also say in the book, the culture war is over because we've lost the bigger ideas that underpin why we would even get involved in social issues or cultural issues. And I mentioned we've lost the fight over what it means to be a human being. We lost the fight over what the meaning of true freedom, and we've lost the fight over what I refer to as moral imagination. And that's how the nation, not just us, but the nation relates to God. Moral imagination. And I won't get into all that. We did that last time. But if you're young parents with young children, I mentioned before, I would never put them in public schools. Never. I tell my own children that, and I'll tell my grandchildren that. Just stay away from public schools.
And I agree to some degree on that. I've really evolved on that, but here's the comments that come in on something whenever I bring that topic up, right? I mean, here I am, I'm a partner in a homeschool curriculum company, right?
Yeah, right.
So you've got, many will say, wow, look at the effect that someone living the gospel and having a solid home and solid principles has as a kid, as a teenager, among their peers, and what an influence that they can be around those that are in school. How would you react to that? Because that is a very common response that I get.
Yeah, and it kind of boils down to the whole idea of socialization as well.
Yes.
And so I would argue you socialize your children at home and on your terms. I mentioned last time we spoke that you want to invite friends. Let's just use that. Your kid wants to sleep over at a friend's house. Just have that friend sleep over at your house. Invite the world into your environment and settings and values. And that way you have that under control. Of our 6 children, the last 4 were all boys, and by and large, they grew up in Utah. And because I was in politics, I was able to help change the homeschool laws in Utah. They used to be pretty bad. But we changed all those laws to the point where my boys all played public school, high school basketball. All 4 of them were captains of their team, and all 4 of them did not attend the high school. We homeschooled. And when it was school's out, practice is on, there they go. So they're going to get exposed. All children, I mean, we're not talking about living in a cave. We're not talking about living in our bubble. We're talking about being real. And we understand that there's a world around us, but we can control that. We can control our exposure and access to that world.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? It's a matter of, okay, because you need to think, to me, you need to think about it from the other standpoint, or for the other side of the coin here, which is how much control are you going to give another adult over your children, and for how long?
Correct.
Right, because that's really what it's down to. Is you're if they're with a teacher every day, most likely the teacher's great, but sometimes they're not. And once you get into junior high and high school, and you've got 6, 7 different teachers during the day, what's being taught, what is the agenda? That's just becoming more and more of an issue. Well, and of course, secondarily, and maybe primarily, it's really just the other kids. It's the other kids. What are they getting you involved with? What are they trying to give you? What are they, it's just other kids that may not have the same structure, or that are not brought up the same way. If you're around them most of the time of the time you're awake, right? What does that mean? What does that do? And I bring it even further up into I'm losing the term here, but going into college, or we have a model of sending kids just out of high school to go off and live somewhere else with someone that they may or may not even know as a roommate, and be around 5, 10, 15, 30,000 other 18 to 22 year olds.
Right.
And put them in this environment while you mortgage your home so that they can go.
Oh,
it's an odd situation. It's evolved into something I don't think that was originally, idealized in secondary education.
Well, and culture is just denigrating, and it's only going to get worse. It's never going to get better. That's something we need to understand. I'm a Latter-day Saint, and I believe, that these are the latter days. And that means there's going to be a decline. One thing, if you have audience members right now who are saying, well, I can't homeschool. I'm a single mom, and I have 2 jobs, whatever it is. And I just can't do it logistically. This brings out the importance of private schools and charter schools. And so the whole school choice movement is tied into this. I was sad to see that the Supreme Court just tied on voting on the.
That was a very interesting case. I don't know what I think about that. Tell me why you were sad to see that, because I kind of see both sides.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the case was, can public dollars go to a private
religious charter school?
I don't know that it was charter even.
I think it was a charter.
Well, either way.
Okay.
Can money go to a school that is primarily run by a specific religious worldview?
Right.
And one of the justices is on the board of a religious private school, and she recused herself.
Yes.
Well, when you have a 6-3 conservative-ish majority, and one of the conservatives leaves, you're at 5-3. And if I don't know who the fourth vote was, there's 3 liberals, right? Probably Justice Roberts.
That would be my guess.
So, then you're at 4-4. Well, when you tie, it doesn't go to the winner.
Mm-hmm.
It
goes to the previous decision.
The way it was.
In the lower court.
Nothing changed. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, school choice is an important part of the homeschooling culture, the Zion culture of making your home a place of Zion. I said there's only 2 safe places on earth: your home and the house of the Lord. Period. Those are the only 2 safe places.
So let's go back to the culture war here, because this really intrigues me, because I've always battled with this, and I tend to lean toward, yes, you should be involved with it to some degree. I don't think that you should be immersed in it necessarily. Your family, your church, your job, all these other things should take a precedent of your time. Otherwise, the anxiety and the what it does to your life, I think, is pretty tough. I don't know how you did it for 40 years. I mean, that's pretty tough. But what about, for example, you say, there's a section of your book called "Please Share a Victory with Me," just one.
Yes.
And so you're saying there's never any victories, but I think that there are. I mean, again, if you look at this as a war, I think there are at least battle victories that are found in the culture. For example, Roe v. Wade, I think was a win, right? I think that a lot of the things that are being pushed through right now are a win in terms of Title IX and et cetera. I think that those are wins. The issue is what you said before, is that these things will never go away. So the question is, if there's no check on those things, how bad will things get? Right? If there's no check, even if you're losing, I mean, it's even when you have, here's what I don't like. I don't like seeing all 3 branches of the government held by one party. I never liked that. And whether it's Republican or not, I don't like it because, first of all, I think they waste the opportunity. And second of all, I want there to be a check. There needs to be a check on things. I have a check on things from my wife. My wife has a check on her from me, and even in my kids to some degree.
Yeah.
There's a check on things. And if we don't fight those battles, at least from a defensive perspective, what happens?
My book is about the culture war is over, and it's been over for 25 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
30 years, I would say, but yes.
And I explain that in the book. And I'm also trying to explain, there are issues that we're going to deal with. Battles never go away because the evil never goes away. It continues to press. We can remember, if you just did a timeline of homosexual special rights, you would start over like, well, can we at least be recognized as human beings? Now we're all the way over to, we don't even know what a human being is anymore. It's whatever surgery or medicine or idea or,
Textbook.
Yeah, right. I mean, kids are dressing up like animals at school. And anyway, so that stuff not only is not going to go away, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. So then the question becomes, what can you do to stop the worse? What can you do to stop the evil? So you mentioned abortion. You mentioned Roe v. Wade being overturned. I just saw an article. Since Roe v. Wade was overturned, there are more abortions now than there were prior to Roe v. Wade on annually. And this is what I'm getting at. This stuff just keeps on keeping on. Uh, when we talk about culture, I'm not talking about like a basketball, that you can just flip around and hand off to this person. Our culture determines our politics and our laws, our culture. So if you read the Book of Mormon, there's at least two different cultures in play.
Mm-hmm.
And so the word culture for me is universal in its impact, and it's not just this little battle over here. For instance, it's not just when I was in Congress trying to kill the National Endowment for the Arts. It's not just that. That was fun, and I have great stories about all sorts of stuff that I put in the book, and a couple of them were victories.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said earlier, I'm talking to my chief of staff friend, and he said to me, "I just feel like I had no impact whatsoever. Like whatever we fought for, meaningless, irrelevant." And again, at the time, certain issues were important, and they hit us like a 2x4 in the face. Um, you deal with them, but if you're a parent, your most important job is in your home. Your most important job is with your spouse and with your children.
Mm-hmm.
Period. Period. And work and all these other things we do are just other things we do. But our family is most important. So why would we? And by the way, and I don't mean this in a misogynist way at all, but I remember in my day, a great woman named Phyllis Schlafly, fought the ERA.
Mm-hmm.
She had 9 children. She was a lawyer, and I don't know when she was at home. I don't know. You got to be kidding me. Or I think, you know what? If I was still around, I would bury that. I would fight that and bury that. But that's me and my career path. That's
Mm-hmm.
not me as a dad,
Mm-hmm.
or a husband. Dads and husbands think way different than you and I think about politics. Our
Sure.
priorities are different, and uh, and so it is a break. It's a break. It's not one foot here, one foot here. It's certainly not both feet in Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
It's both feet in Zion. I that's a covenant that I have made.
Okay, so here's what I would say to that, and
Okay.
I understand what you're saying. I'm fully on board with what you're saying,
No,
but
but push back.
so what about there's a difference between putting a foot into Babylon and having Babylon reach your shore and coming up into your beach, right? And all of a sudden, you do have foot in there because it's encroaching. And this, you can see this in the church. You see this everywhere. I mean, you see this obviously. There are issues with phones and kids with phones, and how access is how the world has access to them. How Babylon has access to kids. There's a lot of things we could talk about there, but it's inevitable. And again, I'll go back to the Book of Mormon and look at the examples there. You never see, not once, do you ever see the Nephites out trying to attack somebody else for land, resources, power,
Right.
anything?
Right.
Nothing. But there's a lot of war in the Book of Mormon. And that war is from a defensive posture. And it's what is being taken from us.
Yeah.
And it's Captain Moroni out there saying, okay, I am going to go out and I'm going to fight for my religion, for my God, for my land, for my liberty, for my wife, for my kids. And they go and they do it because the incursion is so strong and the threat is so strong that there's no choice, because if they don't fight, it's going to implode. Their civilization will implode.
So let's not raise to the level of complete disaster every single little stupid thing that
Agreed.
the world throws at us. And in
Sure.
fact, you know, Captain Moroni, uh, we see him as this great warrior, right? I don't see him that way. I see him as a great man of peace. I mean, every time he looked at the Lamanite king and said, "By the way, friend, I can slaughter you. I will I will knock you out of existence." There's a verse where it says he withdrew a pace. He withdrew a pace.
Mm-hmm.
He stepped back. He doesn't he said, Lamanites, Babylon, live your life. Go live your culture. Do whatever the heck you want to do. Leave us alone.
But the Lamanites didn't have power within the government except for the dissenters who eventually left, who were forced out. Right? They didn't have influence, at least not to a high level that we know of. I mean, maybe things aren't mentioned, but they didn't have the influence within the government. They didn't have the influence within your home, with your rights, with your policies, with your laws, with your freedom of religion, or anything else. That was a separate society. It's kind of like saying, Saudi Arabia, let them be. Okay, that's really easy, right? That's really easy to do. I've got an ocean dividing us, or Iran, right? I've got an ocean dividing us, and a long way to go. And there's some incursion certainly into the universities.
Look,
but
when the Nephites engaged in war, it was because they faced existential threats. Existential threats.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't care about the day-to-day life of the Lamanites.
Agreed.
They only engaged existential threats. And so in my book, when I talk about recommending that our church get out of the culture wars, get out of politics, I also say, but you're in the fight if it's an existential threat. Mm-hmm. So if somebody's trying to take away our religious freedom, and I mean truly, I mean at the core, your individual religious conscience, the stuff that is pure, not our ability to go to a building and worship on Sunday. But I mean all related things having to do with our culture, with church culture. Again, think Nephite, Lamanite. Then there's a fight. Then I'm all in. Then I come out of retirement.
And that's where I'm usually focused, honestly, is actually in that church culture. That's what concerns me.
Okay. Well, but you also mentioned, and I think it's conflated, the again about culture, like the kids at church on their phones. Mm-hmm. Okay. To me, that's a parent who's going to discover real quick that shouldn't happen.
So is that getting involved with the culture war, though? If you're becoming aware of the studies, the emotional distress, especially with young girls, that's happening, and then saying, "Hey, at least I'm aware, and I can make a decision that this is a bad idea to give my 12-year-old a smartphone."
Hey, we grew up with no smartphones, right? No. And so when they were introduced, as parents of budding teenage 6 children,
yes,
we just said no phones. Now I didn't need. It takes everything I have to not swear, So I didn't need a study mm-hmm. to tell me don't give a 10-year-old a phone. I just didn't need a study for that.
But I think some do. right? I think
It,
they
it,
look around and let's say you're a ward and you've got the other parents are giving their kids phones and there's pressure for your kid to have a phone because of that, or if they're at school, the pressure for you to give that. I think that if
that's the
sure, okay,
culture.
maybe you've got more common sense,
No,
but I
that's the
think a lot of people
culture you're
don't.
talking about, I think, right? That's the
Mhm.
culture you're wanting to address is what about the outward world that is affecting my family?
Yes, that is my concern.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
And so I've tried to paint a picture that reduces that exposure. And you
Yes.
can't reduce it altogether. Hey, look, I told you when my homeschool boys went to play public high school basketball, uh, guess what they came home with? A girlfriend. It's like, oh my gosh, you just killed your game, by the way, because that girl is going to take it over. And what I'm saying is, so we deal with it,
Mhm.
right? We just deal
Sure.
with it. To me, that's not the culture war. That's good parenting or bad
Mhm.
parenting. I think there's should be more of a focus on that than whatever the Supreme Court rules on same-sex marriage or
Mhm.
abortion or anything.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, you brought up the church a little bit. Where do you see things right now with the church? You've got another section in the book that is the handshake between the church and Babylon. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember the ERA fight. I remember my mom was a school teacher
Yeah.
and going against most of her fellow teachers. She wasn't out in front of the school with the signs. She was down on the freeway corner of the off ramp with the
Right.
others, with a lot of other Latter Day Saint women that
Because
were
they were
also
told
having
to.
signs fighting on the other side to kill it
Because they were told to
because
by
they were told
a
to.
president of our church
Yes.
that said the ERA is evil. At the time of ERA, I was in Virginia. Virginia was the last state that was the line in the sand
Hmm.
for, you have to have so many states to
Yes.
be able to bring it all to a vote. And I remember it's the first time I ever saw a prophet of God, President Kimball, was at an area conference, and outside the gates of this big arena that all Latter-day Saints in the DC area filled were these feminist, apostate, some Latter-day Saint, most not, I would guess, but Sonia Johnson was one of them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I believe she's from your backyard. But
Yes.
there she, what, 3 months later she was excommunicated. Okay, so in those cases, I am saying, church, don't do that.
Hmm.
That we're citizens, we know how to vote, and we know how to talk to a legislator. Um, But
Right.
we don't have to take time away from our family to do all of that. I mean, to be a
But you do believe
citizen,
in voting on it.
well, yeah, because you're going to have to. At some point, you're going to vote on transgender stuff.
Sure.
I mean, we're all going to be facing these things, and we're all supposed to be good citizens, and I believe in that. And so that's when you want to be informed, because there's going to be some stupid initiative that's on the ballot that's 80 pages long. You have no idea what's in it except some summary that another political guy wrote. And yes, so you need to be informed when that kind of thing happens, but that's your citizenship. That's not culture. That's just you. That's you and your family and your values and what you believe. And I'm not trying to parse this. I really am
No,
not.
no, I think it is good to parse. Actually, I think it's you're so looking at the area. Go back to the area again.
Yeah.
That was something that would affect the law. It would affect policy. Um, and could, but doesn't demand a cultural change within your home or within the church,
Hmm.
right? It's not something that there's not an incursion all the way into your home if you don't want it to be. What it did is give more opportunity, and it would cause a cultural shift quicker
Yeah.
if it was passed culturally in the United States. But again, I think if you parse it out, you say, okay, well, that is the culture. Let them do what they want to that degree, as long as there is not, as you say, an existential threat. If the ERA included something that fought against religious freedoms, or the way that you lived in your home,
Yeah.
or the way you structured your marriage,
Yeah.
then yes, right, that's an incursion, an existential threat to
Right.
very precious things to us.
Right.
Is that fair to say? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I agree with that. And I'd add to it, because back in 1978, when I joined the church, and when the ERA was hair on fire
Yeah.
out in Virginia, um, homeschooling was illegal. We did not have an escape hatch. Now, we broke the law. I fought that. Sally and we fought that.
Because it was a home issue for you. It was a family home issue.
It was strategic disengagement.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying, here's all this crazy. And by the way, we didn't do it because of the ERA. We did it because of just trying to be good parents in the way we thought at the time. But if we didn't have a way out, if we couldn't disengage, and our kids had to continue to go to public school, then they were going to face all sorts of evil if the ERA had passed.
Mm.
You know, the things that we're dealing with men playing women's sports, that would have happened 50 years ago if ERA would have passed. And our children would have been exposed to that. So, yeah, I'm all in favor of laws that allow, that I consider in that case existential, meaning it's the threat of all threats to my family. If I can't say no to Babylon, then that is an existential moment in my life, and I need to go do something about that.
Okay. So
now you mentioned the chapter on the handshake between the church and Babylon. And the point of that chapter, I think, blends into what we're talking about. And the point of that chapter, was to say, the church is in a partnership with Babylon through tax exempt status. There's only certain things Babylon will let the church do. If the church wanted, for instance, if the church wanted to champion individual religious conscience, that specific religious freedom, the IRS and the rest of Babylon, the deep state, however you want to refer to it, would not let the church do that. They would push back and say, you know what, you're entering an arena of politics, because we don't allow that right now. We don't allow individual religious conscience right now. It doesn't exist. And so if the church were to engage that, Babylon would say, you're entering the world of politics, and now your tax exempt status is threatened.
Well, let me follow up on that a little bit. What do you think about the tax exempt issue? I think at some point it's like the universities with the funding.
Yeah.
Are we going to have to break with that? I don't, the tentacles of the government around the church because of the tax exempt status just seems to me like it's going to be leveraged, not by us, by them,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
to a point where
Well, it
we're not
is.
going to want to comply.
Well, it is leverage, and you're right. It's gonna get to a point. Something's gonna happen. Uh, something's gonna happen,
I think so.
and the church is gonna have to make a decision. Uh, I'm recommending in my book that the church prepare for that day right now,
Mm-hmm.
and get its business in order to live without tax exempt status. And then once they have their business in order, go ahead and voluntarily pull out. There's nothing the church can't do um, without tax exempt status, that it currently does. I mean, we still send missionaries out. That's got nothing to do with tax exempt status. Meeting in a building and worshiping God has nothing to do with tax exempt status. Heaven forbid, I know for sure that all the programs of the church have nothing to do with tax exempt status. So the church can still do everything. And I'm saying that they are limited by tax exempt status. And the natural question would be, all right, you give me an example of how the church is limited because of their tax exempt status. Well, I just did, and it's the biggest thing I can think of, and that is exercising your individual religious right of conscience. What do you mean, Paul? What I mean, and I'm going to use probably the most third rail example in the church to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
The Reynolds decision that outlawed plural marriage, or polygamy, as Babylon would call it. In that decision, the Supreme Court threw the baby out with the bathwater. So they not only said you can't do plural marriage, but more importantly, you can't decide. You don't have the right just to decide your religion and what you can do
Mm-hmm.
and can't do. They threw that out. Now, that's been ongoing over 100 and something years. It's been an ongoing legal fight inside the Supreme Court. It's gone back and forth under strict scrutiny, or what's the other term? General application, something like that. There are different standards on how you're going to judge individual cases, like the cake baker, the florist, or the web designer, or whatever. And so that debate still kind of goes back and forth, but the reality is you can't have more than one wife. I don't want more than one wife. I don't want my church to tell me to do that. So I'm happy with how that decision went back in 1860, whatever, 70, whatever. But it impinges on my individual religious conscience. And why I can say that is because when we broke the law in Virginia and pulled our children out of school to homeschool them, and we're in legal fights with the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Attorney General is like on us. That is a moment.
Mm-hmm.
That to us was an existential moment for our family. And they said, well, if there's a religious exemption if you're like the Amish, but there's not a religious exemption for an individual who wakes up one day and says, oh, I want to homeschool my kids. So I had to argue, we had to argue that right of individual religious conscience. We argued that parents have the right to control the upbringing and education of their children. And as Latter-day Saints, we, it's not a right, but we have access to revelation. And we argued, there's our revelation right there. We don't want anybody else educating our children. And we feel by revelation that we're supposed to homeschool these kids. And the AG said, that's ridiculous. Who do you think you are? What do you mean revelation? In other words, like, we're weird, right? We're not Babylon. We're outcasts. We're outsiders. We're odd. We're a peculiar people. And the only way we won that was I worked for a congressman at the time, and he stepped in and he said, here, put your response on my letterhead. And I never heard from the AG again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, the RFMA is a lot like that, right? Where it's you're looking at there's no individual protection with the RFMA, right? Because the RFMA went out and said, okay, well, if you're an institution, if you're an organization, you're protected as a church. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is protected. You do not have to have gay marriage in your temples. You don't have to allow it. Your institutions like BYU, you don't have to allow same-sex affection on the campuses. You can make your own choices on that. But when it comes to an individual, there are zero rights in the RFMA whatsoever. There's nothing. So the church members themselves
exactly
don't get anything out of that.
Exactly. And I try to spend a couple chapters on that idea alone. That, like, in 2015 to this day, Utahns celebrate what was called the Utah Compromise. And that's when gay rights were given on employment and housing. And the church led the fight in favor of that.
Yes, yes.
And so they celebrate that. Yeah, guess who doesn't have a right to be exempted from that law? Us.
Yeah.
The church as an institution got itself exempted from that law. But Paul Mero's not exempted from that law.
That's a real conflict for someone who's a member of the church, right? Because you're like, okay, I want my church to be protected. I want them to have this additional, protection that is wrapped around the institution, because I don't want them to have to do these things. But what about me?
Yeah, well, first of all, there was never a threat to the church at all. So when some of our church leaders argue, well, we supported the Respect for Same-Sex Marriage Act because we wanted to make sure we were protecting religious freedom as we are supporting same-sex marriage.
Do you think it's just an olive branch then?
No. No. I think it was more than that. I think it was a huge blunder, a huge mistake. So in other words, the church, in endorsing same-sex marriage, which our church did on the Respect for Marriage Act, in endorsing same-sex marriage, the argument is, well, we're going to do that if we have these religious freedoms protected, like no homosexuals getting married in the temple. Okay. First of all, that's not even a threat. That's not a threat.
Well,
And
not today, at least.
hey, look, if it ever is, then it's all over, right? If the sanctity of the temple is violated, it's all over. Everything's over. You're at the end of the Book of Mormon at that point, I believe. I don't think it's like 5 years away when something like that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. I think it's whenever the crazy explodes, then stuff like that might be, threatening. It's an existential threat. So the church, we didn't gain anything. And yes, like the Utah Compromise, like Respect for Marriage Act, the institutional church was, quote unquote, protected in their religious freedoms. So on the Utah Compromise over employment and housing, you're not going to see homosexuals, you know, with badges on Temple Square, working for the church, knowingly, openly, you know, wearing a pride pin or whatever. That's not going to happen. But if I own a fourplex apartment and and I want my tenants to have certain values, I'm not allowed to enforce that at all. Now, the world, Babylon would say, well, why would you discriminate against somebody who's gay anyway? You know, well, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe if it's a gay couple, you know, white picket fence that looks like all the rest of us look, and versus some gay guy who they now call themselves queer, who comes in with pink hair and earrings all over the place and plants a flag outside his apartment door, you know, flying it. And my kids are walking around like, who's that guy and what's that, right? You know, then I probably would say no. On employment, it's the same thing. You know, the church is enforced under these laws, the state law, the compromise, and then respect for marriage. The church is enforced to hire homosexuals. But if I have a business, say I have a bank, I run a bank, and I have a guy who's been there 15 years. He's great guy. And one day he comes in a dress, lipstick, makeup, and a wig, and he's a front teller. I don't have any recourse whatsoever. None. None. I mean, maybe somebody could argue that, well, you know, you have a dress code or something like that. But even today, that's nonsense, right? I mean, that's how bad things have gotten. But so if that person comes in dressed like that, then as an individual business owner, I'm not protected.
When did you start to go down this road? Because you were very much on the other end of the spectrum for most of your career.
Yeah.
Right. Where you are you are the dog in the fight.
Yeah.
That the congressman would put you out there as the dog in the fight.
Right.
And you'd go get it done.
Yeah.
That's a big extreme change for you, right? At what point did you start to look at things differently?
Yeah, I think 2014. 2014 was a personal watershed time for me and our family. After 14 years, I was fired as the head of Sutherland Institute, which at the time really was the most influential conservative voice in Utah, outside of whatever conservative voices were left on Temple Square. And I got fired from that. But also, it was the moment in April, and I wish I could remember the date, but it was an April date, probably 2 weeks after General Conference, that President Oaks, then Elder Oaks, gave a talk at UVU. What does that stand for?
Utah Valley University.
Utah Valley University, sorry. And at UVU, myself and a mutual friend of ours were invited specifically to come listen to this talk, where then Elder Oaks said, no more contention, no more contending. We're going to not just stop, like President Nelson is saying. When he says no more contention, he means stop contending. What then Elder Oaks said was a step beyond that. We're not only not contending, we're going to accommodate gay rights and the homosexual community. That those two things combined, I think in 2014 is what got me to start thinking, it's time. I mean, it's really over. If Dallin H. Oaks is saying accommodate the gays, I think it's over. I think it's over. Now, I still had to make a living, and I didn't know anything else. But I switched up my whole menu of what I worked on politically over to poverty issues, where I knew I could have an impact as a conservative on poverty issues, and specifically intergenerational poverty, and I did. And so I think during those years after 2014, moving into probably 2018, that's when my mindset switched. It's the war is over. And you're right when you say, I was involved for such a long time. I mean, you might call me, Sally would call me a workaholic, but that's the equivalent of being like a drug addict, right? How do you stop? How do you, after 40 years of fighting a culture, how do I stop that? That's ingrained in me. That's what I was famous for, infamous for. When I would go to church, that's what I was known for. Those kinds of social environments, it was me. That was my world. That's how I thought. And it's not easy to stop an addiction, if you will. And I understand. I understand why we're having this conversation. I understand what you're saying. I understand why the church right now would never get rid of tax exempt status. I understand right now why the church would never canonize the family proclamation. I understand why they stay involved in all sorts of things politically. And by the way, it's not as pronounced with President Nelson as it was with prior presidents of the church, but it's still there, especially in Utah. The lobbyists, the church lobbyists, the home teachers, all they have to do is go in and whisper in a legislator's ear, an LDS legislator's ear, don't do that. And that piece of
But if the message is do not contend, why do they have that? What's the point of having lobbyists for the church if they're not going to contend?
Because they want to protect things. They think they're protecting things. And it could be the perimeter around Temple Square. When Rocky Anderson was mayor of Salt Lake City, he allowed a strip club right around the corner from Temple Square. It could be things like that. Those aren't existential threats, but it's certainly, if you're working on Temple Square, or if you're one of the brethren in the short building, the administration building, and you look out and there's hookers, walking up and down the street, yeah, that would bug you. And you'd want to do something about it. So that's why they do stuff. Liquor laws is another example. Medical marijuana is another example.
But wait a minute. I mean, I know people that were very involved with the medical marijuana. That was something that the church completely flipped on, by the way. But
when did it flip, and why?
Well, they were against it until there was a certain group in Utah that came in and said, "Hey, we're going to go forward with this. We're going to get the majority. Are you going to go along with us or not?" Essentially,
I think it was a little further down the road, and they saw the writing on the wall. And at that point, the church is pretty wise about these kinds of things. For instance, so they oppose it, and then they end up kind of quietly endorsing it. You don't see a parade or anything. You don't see what we saw with the Utah Compromise, hugging and kissing and stuff. But, it's kind of like the tobacco companies. The tobacco companies were faced with an existential threat. You're either going to abide by government regulation, or you're not going to be in business anymore. And what did they do? They welcomed government regulation. Why? Because now their business goes on forever. It's the same thing with the church. Why, in fact, why feed a dead horse, right? If medical marijuana becomes the state law, why would you say anything more about it? It is, right? It just is at that point, because it's not an existential threat to the church. It could be a problem for us individuals, but, it's not an existential threat.
Yeah. All right, Paul. Well, I appreciate your time again on this. I'm not yet to where you're at. I still have to think all of this through. I still feel like, and it's not like I'm someone that kind of goes out as the tip of the spear on specific party or candidate or,
Right.
That's just not me. I don't do that kind of thing. I want to look at the effects of things, the issues, get down deep into the foundational truths on these things and the social implications. But I don't know.
I should say,
But you're on the show.
With Greg, I know, but I should say, I'm not talking about Greg Mattson giving up his podcast.
Yeah.
I'm not saying don't talk about things. I mean, what you talk about is interesting, and it has impact on individual lives. I know it does. So I'm not talking about, how you make a living.
Yeah, you're talking about going out and living in Babylon, or where you're mentally, emotionally, you're out there.
Yeah, I'm talking about the wrong idea about Captain Moroni, that he was this hard-charging warrior who would have preferred to kill Lamanites than go home.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that wasn't Moroni at all. Moroni would rather go home than kill Lamanites. And that along with Jesus Christ's example itself, don't fight these wars.
Mm-hmm.
Don't fight these wars. But mostly, Greg, because they're all over. There's nothing left to salvage,
mm-hmm.
because the big ideas were lost. The big ideas were lost 25, 30 years ago in the United States of America.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Paul. Well, appreciate that. I would give another example is Christ in the temple. That was an existential threat, right? When he's tossing the tables and talking about the den of thieves, there's an existential threat to the temple there.
Yeah, I think he took that personally. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. The book, Defeated, by Paul T. Mero. So you can go out and find that on Amazon and other places. Paul, appreciate it again. You're a good friend. Appreciate your words. And I always take everything in and try and understand it and listen to your experience. So
I know you do. And I know that this will sink in at some point and you go, oh man, that dude's right. Now you're going to see comments like, oh my gosh, there he goes again. He's so arrogant, but
well, that's kind of beside the point, whether you are or not.
I know, but I don't want people to hate me.
Right, okay. All right, Paul. Well, I like you. So appreciate your time.
Thank you.